Hey guys, today we are going to look at the immune system. Now this is kind of exciting, very interesting because we're still in the middle of a pandemic, right? So that has everything to do with the immune system. Now another thing I want to kind of talk about in this lesson is the lymphatic system. Now most of the study manuals do not have a separate chapter for the lymphatic system, but it's really closely connected to the immune system, to the circulatory system. So I think it will be important to talk about this particular body system and how it functions in junction with the other two systems. Okay, so since one of the major functions for the lymphatic system is to monitor for foreign invaders and participate in the immune response, so I think it's more appropriate to kind of tag it along this lesson 9, which is about the immune system. All right. Now, let's do a quick overview of the immune system. So the immune system is a little bit special. It's not an organ system that has specific organs that perform specific functions. It really kind of consists of a variety of molecules and immune cells. But of course, there are some organs that are involved in the immune system. For example, bone marrow, right, which is the site where the immune cells, such as lymphocytes, are produced. The immune system is there to provide immunity and defense, and this is critical for our survival, right? Every day we're exposed to trillions and trillions of microorganisms in the environment, some of which can be pathogenic. So pathogenic means that they can cause diseases, but most of the times we are staying healthy, right? Which is really amazing. So that's all thanks to the immune system. So now let's look at some of the details and talk about how the immune system works. I made this kind of chart, a flow chart, to kind of give you a better idea of how the immune system is organized. So the system has two divisions. The first one is called the innate defense system, and the second one is the adaptive defense system. So you can see that the innate defense system is non-specific. It just means that it will try to prevent the entry of a variety of microorganisms and fight against them if somehow they breach the first physical barriers of our body. They do not target a specific bacterium or a specific virus. They will just try to fight anything that's considered a foreign invader. Now, on the other hand, the adaptive defense system is very specific. You can think of it as the kind of the elite military branch of our body, I guess. So they will try to target a specific virus, a specific, let's say, fungus, specific bacterium. So they are very, very specific. So that's one of the major differences between the two divisions. All right, now let's look at the innate system first. So the innate defenses consist of two lines of defense. The first one is the surface barriers. As you can imagine, first of all, we want to prevent the entry of any pathogens into our body, right? So we need to have some kind of physical barrier. So that's what we have in the first line of defense. That includes the skin, the mucous membranes, and also those physical barriers are equipped with some chemical weapons. And we'll talk about this in more defense. One thing I want to kind of point out is that we do have some beneficial microorganisms living on the skin, on our body, and inside our body, right? For example, in the large intestine. So these beneficial microorganisms do not make us sick. They actually have this kind of mutual beneficial relationship with us. So we provide them with space, with nutrients for them to survive, to grow, and they in return will compete with pathogenic microorganisms. So they will try to compete with those bad microorganisms for space, for resources. So they actually help us kind of keep those pathogenic microorganisms at control. So some people consider the beneficial microorganisms as part of our kind of defense system that keeps us healthy. All right, now if the surface barriers are breached, we have the second line of defense that will be put into work. So this second line of defense is composed of some of the immune cells that can directly fight the pathogens, some antimicrobial proteins, which can also damage or kill the pathogens. And there are also some processes that you guys are pretty familiar with, and those are also our kind of responses to the invasion of pathogens. So again, we'll talk about this in more details in a second. Now, the adaptive defense system has the third line of defense, and like I said, that's the elite military branch, right, that targets a specific type of a pathogen. There are two arms in the adaptive defense system. The first one is Humera Immunity. So this kind of arm, this subdivision involves antibodies. And I want to point out here that the antibodies are produced by B cells. And this information is very important. I have seen questions on this, a few times. So whenever I get to this, I will kind of remind you that the antibodies are part of the Humera immunity, and antibodies are secreted by B cells. So hopefully the more times I mention this, the better you will remember this. All right, the second second subdivision is this cellular immunity, also known as cell-mediated immunity. So this division or subdivision involves mostly T cells. And we'll talk about what T cells do and the different kinds of T cells. All right. Now, before I move on to the next slide, I want to point out a typo in one of the TEAS study manuals. If you have this version in the immune system, they said that this is the original wording. They said the innate immune system has 3 lines of defense, and that's not correct, right? As you can see in my flow chart, the innate system has only 2 lines of defense. So that's not correct. I think it's a typo. I think they really meant the entire immune system has 3 lines of defense. All right, now let's look at more closely at the innate immune system. If you remember, first line, of course, that's the physical barrier and some of the chemicals that are secreted by this physical barrier that can further help prevent or inhibit the growth of microorganisms. So everybody's familiar with the skin. I remember when we talk about skin, I think we mentioned that burn victims are very susceptible to infection, and that's because they lost their skin. They lost the physical barrier, right, that prevents the entry of pathogens. Mucous membrane, we also talk about mucous membrane along with the skin. So think about the inner lining of your respiratory tract, urinary tract, reproductive tract. So the mucous membrane is also part of the physical barrier. Now, on the skin and the mucous membrane, there are some chemical weapons that our body has. For example, acid, right? We, especially, if you care a lot about your skin, you probably know that the skin has a lower pH than neutral pH. So skin is slightly acidic, right? So the acid on the skin or the acidic environment can inhibit bacterial growth. And same thing for the vaginal canal, right? The vaginal secretion also makes the vagina acidic because that can inhibit bacterial growth. There are also a lot of enzymes in things like saliva, right? When you eat, the salivary glands secrete saliva. Now, saliva has digestive enzymes that can help you digest starch, but saliva also has enzymes that can kill microorganisms. And that's because when you eat, right, the food is not sterile. So we want to, do as much as possible, right, to kind of kill the pathogens before they get further into our body. Tears also have enzymes that can be antimicrobial to kind of clean our eyes. Stomach is also very acidic, very, very acidic. So the stomach acid can kill most of the pathogens that are in the food. Mucus. Now, mucus is secreted by the cells in the mucous membrane. For example, your respiratory system secretes a lot of mucus, right? And you probably know that the mucus is very sticky, right? very sticky. So it's very good to kind of trap particles, debris, and pathogens that's in the air and get into your respiratory system. So the mucus is a very interesting kind of defense. So what happens is, let's say this is your trachea, right? The cells secrete mucus. So let's say that's the mucus. I know it's not very accurate, my drawing, but you get the idea. So let's say this is the mucus, and because it's kind of sticky, kind of gross, right? It traps a lot of particles and pathogens. And once it's done its job, you have the inner lining cells in your trachea that have those hair-like structures called cilia. So what happens is the cells will move the cilia, right, in a kind of this down-up motion, down, up, down, up, down, up. So this is the movement of the cilia can sweep the mucus up, right? Because you don't want the mucus to stay deep in your respiratory system, right? You want to get it out because it has a lot of pathogens stuck in the mucus. So you want to get the mucus out. So the cilia will sweep the mucus up until it gets your throat, so that you can cough and get rid of it, or you can swallow. The mucus reaches your stomach and the acid can kill everything. So you can do that as well. For people with cystic fibrosis, you probably have heard of this disease, and we'll talk about that in a later chapter. So people with cystic fibrosis, they have a very thick mucus, very, very thick. Now, when it gets too thick, it's going to be very hard for the cilia to sweep it, toward the throat. So the mucus tends to stay there, and guess what? That's a very moist, a very warm environment. So pathogens are going to multiply, they're going to grow very happily, and this often leads to the infection in the lower respiratory system, right? So people with cystic fibrosis can often get lung infections. All right, now let's look at the second line of defense. So remember, this involves soldiers, right? It's not just physical barriers and chemical weapons. Now it involves soldiers that can actually fight the pathogens invaded in the body. So the first type of cell that we're going to talk about is phagocytes. So phago means eat, right? These immune cells can directly kill the pathogens by engulfing them, by swallowing them. So the first phagocyte is actually from neutrophil. So when we talk about the blood chapter, we'll talk about 5 types of leukocytes, which are also known as white blood cells, okay, WBCs. Now, neutrophil is the most abundant white blood cell in the blood, and there's a reason for it, because neutrophils are often one of the first responders to infection, to injury. When there's injury, neutrophils will be called to the site of injury, so they are going to leave the blood and they're going to enter the tissues. Once they enter the tissues, they obtain this superpower. They become phagocytic. So now they're able to engulf, say, bacteria cells and, try to protect our body. The second type of phagocyte is from a monocyte. Again, monocyte is one of the 5 types of leukocytes. It's not as abundant as neutrophil, but it can be ferocious. It can be very aggressive. So similar to neutrophils, monocytes can be called to the site of injury, and once monocytes leave the blood and enter the tissues, they become macrophages. So these macrophages have a big appetite for foreign invaders. All right, now the next type of immune cell that participates in the second line of defense is natural killer cells, NK cells. Now these NK cells do not engulf pathogens. They kind of do a different type of job. They do not attack free-ranging bacteria. So phagocytes do. So what happens is, if you, let's say these are your body cells, okay? So these are the cells. And you have some bacteria that happen to kind of enter our body through, let's say, a cut in the skin, right? And these phagocytes can locate these little bacteria cells, right? And engulf these bacteria cells. So you can see these bacteria cells, they are free, right? They are living outside the cells. So that's what phagocytes do. Now, the NK cells, they do not target free bacteria cells. They don't have that ability to eat them. Instead, they have a different group of targets. So what they do is they are going to kind of try to find a virus infected or tumor cells, and they will attack those cells. So you may know that viruses are kind of like a parasites, right? Now, in order for viruses to survive and multiply, they have to be inside a cell. So let's say this is a cell, right? So the virus has to gain entry into the cell. And once they're inside the cell, yes, they can survive for a very long time, and they can multiply. They can make more copies of the virus. So you can see these viruses, they're not free, right? They do not live outside the cell. They live inside the cell. So those phagocytes are not going to be able to do anything about those viruses, right? Because the viruses are inside a cell and not free floating outside the cell. So this requires a different group of cells to provide the defense function, right? So that's going to be the NK cells. And same thing for kind of tumor cells, right? Those are our own cells, and the phagocytes usually do not engulf, a living cell from our body. That's not their job. So the NK cells can detect, let's say that's a tumor cell. So usually tumor cells have some abnormalities that can trigger the NK cells to, try to kill them. All right. The second thing, or the third thing, is the antimicrobial proteins. So there are two major ones, interferons. So interferons are proteins secreted by virus-infected cells. So what happens is once those cells are infected by the virus, they know that they're not going to survive, right? But there are still some cells, healthy cells, that have not been infected yet. So these infected cells will try to save those healthy cells by secreting proteins called interferons. And those interferons can help the healthy cells inhibit the replication of the virus. So basically, the interferons interfere with the replication of the virus so that the virus cannot, start a colony, for lack of better words, start a colony inside the healthy cells. Okay. The second group is called complement. So complement are plasma proteins. So what does this mean? Plasma, that's a part of the blood. Remember when we talk about the different components of blood, and the plasma is kind of the liquid component of the blood, right? So these proteins are soluble in, so these proteins are usually located in the plasma. So they kind of get circulated throughout our body in blood. Now, this complement is really a group of plasma proteins. So when there is infection, these plasma proteins will be activated, and they can really kind of promote the inflammation process. And they can also directly lyse cells. They can directly kill a bacteria cell. So that's what complement proteins do. All right, next two are not a specific molecule or immune cell. So those two are kind of processes that our body kind of triggers in response to infections or injury. First one, you know what? Let me talk about fever first, and then we'll talk about inflammation, because I have another slide about inflammation. Fever. Let's see. Fever is pretty common, right? I'm sure everybody has had fever before. This is our normal body temperature, and when you look at homeostasis, one of the jobs that we need to do is to maintain a stable body temperature, right? So again, normal temperature is 37 C or 98.6 in Fahrenheit. So when there is infection, the immune cells will secrete pyrogens. So pyrogens are chemicals, again, secreted by those immune cells in response to invasion. And the pyrogens will act on hypothalamus. Hypothalamus. Remember, we talk about hypothalamus when we talk about the nervous system. So it's a structure in the brain. Hypothalamus is our body's thermostat. Okay, meaning it controls our body temperature. The pyrogens can make hypothalamus raise our body temperature. Okay. Now, what does this do? Because everybody has experienced fever before, and you know it's kind of miserable, right? You feel really crappy. So we don't exactly know how fever helps us fight infections. Now, you may have heard of a lot of theories. They all sound reasonable, but again, we don't know exactly yet. But this is what scientists think. Fever causes the liver and spleen to sequester iron and zinc. And iron and zinc are nutrients that bacteria use for growth. So if there is a lack of those nutrients, then that's going to slow down bacterial growth, right? Which is good. And also, we think that once your body temperature goes up, higher temperature promotes chemical reactions, right? So fever may be able to increase the metabolic rates of tissue cells, and then really kind of speed up this repair process, right, after the injury. Last, let's look at inflammation. So inflammation is actually good, even though a lot of times we feel that inflammation is really bad, because a lot of times it gives us pain, right, and discomfort. But it is our body's natural response to infection. In inflammation, there are a bunch of inflammatory chemicals released, which lead to all those, crappy feelings that you have, such as pain, swelling. I need you to remember one inflammatory chemical, which is histamine. Histamine. This is easy to remember because you probably know that a lot of drugs are out there for people with allergies, and most of those drugs are anti-histamine, right? So they can kind of really dampen the effect of histamine. So histamine is secreted by mast cells. Let's look at this diagram, and we can see what happens in inflammation. So let's say you have a cut, right? Right here, that's a cut. And then some of the pathogens that are originally on your skin invade your body, and that's going to trigger inflammation response. Injured tissue cells, such as mast cells and immune cells, both they can release a lot of inflammatory chemicals, like I said earlier, and one of them is histamine. So the histamine is going to cause vasodilation. Dilation. If you remember, when we talk about the blood vessels, vasodilation means the blood vessel is dilating, right, which allows more blood flow to the site of injury. That's a very good thing. For one, blood has all those leukocytes, right, which are part of our defense system. So more blood flow will bring in more white blood cells to the site of injury to fight the pathogens. So you can see, the neutrophils and the monocytes, they will become phagocytes, right? They will start to engulf the bacteria. So you can see it right here. They can just swallow the bacteria cell. Another thing is we talk about the antimicrobial proteins, right? So we talk about the complement. And remember, the complement, those are the plasma proteins, right? Those are the proteins that are located in the blood. So the blood flow, the increase in blood flow, can also bring in the antimicrobial proteins to the site of injury to help those immune cells fight the pathogens. Okay, now histamine can also lead to, first one, vasodilation, but histamine can also make the blood vessels leaky. leaky. Okay, so what happens is histamine can increase the permeability of the blood vessel wall. It makes it more permeable, right? Basically, it makes it kind of more leaky. So the plasma proteins can come out, the protective proteins can come out, the white blood cells can come out more easily, right? They can squeeze through the cells that make up the blood cell walls, and there will be more fluid leaking out of the blood, right? Remember, the fluid plasma part contains the antimicrobial proteins. Right? You can see, all those things are good, right, in terms of fighting the infection. But this can cause a lot of discomfort, right? If the blood vessels become leaky, then you have, like we said, that will lead to an increasing amount of fluid accumulating in the site of injury, right? So that's going to cause edema, which is swelling. And also, the increasing amount of fluid often presses against your nerve endings in the tissues, and that's what's causing pain. Well, okay. Now, I have seen quite a few questions on inflammation, on histamine, and the inflammation process in general. So you might want to have a pretty good knowledge of inflammation.